Okay, gang, let's move on now to the introduction, and I think this chapter is pretty self-explanatory. However, there are some points to which I want you to attend. Now, those of you familiar with our lesson planning model should be writing in your margins, yes, and geez, Jerry is a genius. Those of you new to lesson planning, well, you'll have to take my word about my genius. Actually, it's the genius of understanding by design. Here are the points I want to iterate now and will reiterate throughout the semester. First, keeping our content complex, complicated, clear, and competent. Second, creating the flow. Third, the idea that entropy is bad and activity is good. Fourth, planning your work and working your plan. Fifth, teaching something. And sixth, saying more by saying less. I love that Hillocks uses words like complex and complicated. Listen, thinking is hard work. And the more advanced the stuff about which we think, and the more complex the materials we read, then the more complicated are the arguments we need to craft. That does not mean that work can't be fun or the topics interesting. I remember sitting at a Rockies game one day listening to the guys behind me talking about fantasy teams. It was the most complicated thing I had ever heard, but to them it was a blast. Or when I get a student who explains some geeky computer thing to me, I am terrified by the concepts, but the student is all over it. Complex and complicated are not pejoratives. Hillocks' other two C words are equally important. Remember, when we talk about writing, our goal is to make meaning, and if we want our audience to get our meaning, we need to be clear. If clarity is our aim, then we need to know that pretentious jargon, long and confusing sentences, and disorganization in how we present stuff, all of that muddles the writing and therefore the meaning. I ask my students, what does a good writer do to help you get his or her point? And the answers usually go like this. They use words I can understand. They write in an easy-to-read way. They give me examples. They show me what they mean. Well, each of these aids to making meaning clear to the audience is something we'll look at, and something you will need to be prepared to teach. Finally, the idea of competence. Somewhere along the way, being competent was no longer a reasonable goal. Everybody has to be a freaking star. Everybody gets a trophy. Not in my world. And if you think some kid who can't hit a baseball for love or money feels honored by the trophy you give him, then you don't know shit about kids. They know when you are shining them on. In teaching students to make meaning, we need to understand that we are not creating Pulitzer Prize winning writers. We're creating writers who can make meaning effectively and competently. Here's a pointless story. When I met the DGS of my PhD program, he pulled out my college transcripts. Aside, he was an asshole. Anyway, he looks them over and he says to me, "You got a D in microeconomics." "Uh-huh," says I, hence my getting a PhD in English and not economics. All I wanted was to be competent in econ. I never achieved that, witness my D. I did get a C in macroeconomics, and I immediately changed my major to theology. We need a kind of shift in our thinking. What must our students be able to do with their meaning-making skills? How can we make them competent? Once again, the best way to answer this question is to go to the source. What kind of writing do you want to be able to do? What kind of meaning do you need to be able to make? Hillocks talks about the flow. So does Kelly Gallagher in Read Aside. In his use of the term, and Kelly Gallagher, like me, is a devotee of Hillocks, Gallagher refers to students reading, the idea that when we are in the flow, we read and time disappears. And Gallagher and I both agree that when we interrupt readers with too many study questions or require too many sticky notes, when we chop texts into so many small bites, we interrupt the flow. Hillocks, via the psychologist with a really long name with lots of consonants that I can't pronounce, suggests that the flow, or quote, optimal experience, is more than just getting lost in a work. It's being challenged by it. The flow adds complexity to the self. I like this distinction because too often students tell me they were carried away by some god-awful novel. Can you say Twilight? But Twilight and similar popular texts provide, quote, the simple fleeting pleasure described by the guy with the long name as homeostatic experiences, homeostasis, internal equilibrium. But flow, to Hillocks and the guy with the long name, is about disequilibrium. And flow does have some prerequisites. Hillocks asks us to think about classroom practices and elements that you, as a teacher, can control in order to promote the flow. First, the tasks you assign to students must be doable. That is, they must be within their ZPD, their zone of proximal development. If you don't know what that means, ask me. And the student has to feel as if he or she has some control over the outcome. Second, there must be sufficient time to complete the task. Third, there must be clear goals, and these goals must be explicit. And fourth, immediate feedback must be offered. These simple steps will help you establish the flow for your students, and these are the things we're going to focus on during the course of the semester. Now, entropy to me smacks of science, and I suck at science. But I am competent enough to follow what Hillocks is saying. After all, there's nothing surprising in the assertion in the introduction that students are more engaged when they are active and not passive. By this point in your training, you should be familiar with the idea of the student-centered classroom. You should recognize the value of meaningful group activity. You should embrace the increasing emphasis on problem-based learning, and you should disdain the students as vessels teaching philosophy. For those of you who have read Hard Times, Dickens's fabulous novel, you know that we have rejected Gradgrindian education in favor of the notions articulated by my much-loved Mr. Sleary. The people must have their amusements. What I think is interesting about all this is how we can see that it is kind of the theory behind flipping. In the flipped classroom, what we are kind of sort of doing this semester, you get the instruction in a way that works with your generation's high-tech skills, social media. And for me, what we are doing with these PowerPoint-y voice things is very high-tech. Then the class time becomes doing. Now, I don't want to get into the whole flipping thing here, and because it relies on out-of-class work, I'm not even sure how it will work in middle and high school, where just a few short years ago there was a whole contentious debate about homework at all. But I posted 2 links if you're interested in learning more about flipping, and they're under course material. And if you just go to Google, you can find a ton of other stuff about the flipped classroom. The point is, we must get students doing. And as you think about your own classroom, the mini lesson learning plan, one that promotes planned and meaningful activity, will help guide your instruction to this important end. A frustration with the lessons developed by beginning teachers, and frankly by too many experienced teachers, is their failure to teach anything. The learning plan we use requires direct instruction, yet too often lessons teach nothing. Hillocks' point about having clear and specific goals and objectives is simple. These tell you what you need to teach. Kelly Gallagher's tack is worth considering. He teaches to the test, and there is nothing wrong with that if the test is a good one. Think about it. You design unit plans, and you must. That's non-negotiable. Any teacher who tells you otherwise is, I promise you, a shitty teacher. And don't tell me you know teachers who don't operate that way and they don't plan, but they are awesome. They are not. And I will prove it to you by showing you what you don't know and you can't do despite your awesome teacher. Okay, rant over. Where was I? Okay. If you design the unit plan, then you determine what skills your students must master in conjunction with departmental or district requirements. The unit plan identifies the skills that you want your students to be able to do. Your job is to prepare them with those skills such that they can succeed on the assessments you devise to measure their mastery. The thing is, you have to teach them. If you don't teach them, then you can't test them. To test them on things you haven't taught is unreasonable. As Hillocks expresses it, you must ask yourself, what instruction will prepare students to complete the tasks I assign? This is at the heart of backwards planning, and backwards planning is at the heart of understanding by design, and understanding by design is the lesson plans that we will be using. Finally, a lesson I could use is saying more with less. Teachers love to talk, and for students it's too easy to sit back and listen. Lecturing is great because each party gets to do what they like. But lecture produces, at best, limited real learning. Discussion, on the other hand, gets students talking and listening. However, we need to train students to discuss with each other, not talk at each other, and we need to help them learn to listen. Hillocks will model this approach in his descriptions of the classrooms where he teaches his model of argument writing. So pay attention to those sections and begin to recognize the areas where we see him encouraging talking and listening. And both limited lecture and subsequent discussion must always be the precursor to student activity. So lecture sparingly and make those lectures count. Say more with less lecture. And the same goes for grading, which is an aspect of teaching about which it seems all teachers complain. I don't complain about grading because I practice what I teach. When grading students' writing, I think we get more when we say less. Now, we'll talk much about assessment and feedback this semester. I think we should, with beginning writers, distinguish between the two, feedback and assessment. For example, my method is to provide feedback to polish drafts. I assess, without significant feedback, final versions. In giving feedback, I practice the two suggestions of Hillocks. 1, I use language and terms that students understand. Because I have taught them those terms, because I have taught them the content I am assessing, I know that the terms I use will be meaningful to them. 2nd, I adhere to these words from the introduction. Quote, we need to focus our feedback on no more than 2 or 3 related dimensions of the task at a time and emphasize what the learners have done well. Read that again on page 9 of Hillocks' introduction. It's vital to becoming an effective assessor. To these two I add one with which I know Hillocks and Gallagher would concur. If you don't use a well-crafted rubric, then quit your bitchin' about grading. It's your own damn fault. And we'll talk about rubrics a ton this semester. So keep these practices in mind during the semester, both as you think about your future as one who grades and as you received graded writing. Okay? Excellent. On to chapter 1.